The growing phenomenon of young adults going no contact with their parents over ideology.
And it's a new rising phenomenon being written about more and more often all over TikTok, what I call TikTok psychologists. You chose to have me. I did not choose to be born. So you owe me everything. I don't owe you anything. Once you elevate the identity of woundedness, you start looking at your history for a culprit for that. And parents are kind of a natural place to put that.
What has been the most tragic story that has caught your eye?
So I've been interviewing a ton of families, and one story sticks out in my mind. This dear father and mother and their daughter, she had already...
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Lila Rose Show. Today, I'm sitting down with my friend Noelle Mering, who is a founder over at Theology of Home, and she's also a fellow at EPPC, the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She is writing a new book and doing research on this very, I guess it's a dark trend, but it's also very important to understand. It's very interesting, where family members are increasingly freezing each other out, especially children freezing out or going no contact with their parents. Now, you might know somebody who's actually experienced this, or you have family members in the last 5 years, because of one of the many big things that have happened in the last 5 years, has decided to build big walls between themselves and a family member. This can be really painful and tragic, but I hope this interview with Noelle will bring some hope and understanding. She provides some background about why this is happening, as well as her research showing how we can make meaningful steps towards building unity and harmony again, based on the truth in our families with the ones that we love. Also, don't forget to subscribe. If you're here on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed. If you're listening on podcast app, make sure you're subscribed. And if you're on podcast app, please leave us 5 stars, give us a review. I read all of them and I really appreciate it. And it also helps the podcast reach more people. Noelle Mering, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm so excited to talk to you. Here. We have some mutual connects. One very wonderful spiritual guide, Father Paul Donlin. I know we've both been very blessed by over the years.
We have. Yeah.
So I do feel like you're a bit of a spiritual sister, even though I haven't gotten to talk to you very much or get to know you, except now I'm getting that opportunity here. So
no, that's right. He always talks to us about each other. So
yes,
his spiritual daughters, he likes to connect.
Yes. He's always saying, you got to talk to Noelle. You got to talk to Noelle. So here we are. We're talking. Your work, I've noticed it over the years. Theology of Home is beautiful. Yeah, so there might be some ladies listening who are fans. I want to hear about that. You also have the book Awake Not Woke, which I think you kind of coined the idea of being awake, not woke. My understanding is CPAC at one point even picked up the phraseology from your book.
And they reached out to my publisher actually to make sure it was okay. And then I went out and did a book signing. So it was great. You know, it's a simple, nice, strong title, which I like. Simple
Amazing.
Titles. Yeah.
And then you've got this new work, your research you're doing on the growing phenomenon of young adults going no contact with their parents over ideology.
Right. Yep. Tentatively called no contact. So yeah, it's a new rising phenomenon. It's been written about in the New York Times, I think 3 times now, maybe 4. I mean, it's being written about more and more often. New Yorkers covered it, The Guardian, Time Magazine, NPR. I mean, it's exploded everywhere. And the storylines tend to be, you know, why is Gen Z cutting off their parents? And often over ideology. And it's a lot of kind of head scratching and what's happening, covering this phenomenon, not sure exactly what to do with it. So I had already decided to write the book before I started seeing all these articles. So it was interesting to see them all come out as I'm writing it. I'm trying to write it faster and faster. Vox too. Vox has written about it several times. But, so yeah, there's a certain urgency. And I think, you know, the election 2024 kind of probably led to a lot of articles emerging because of this. But I actually wanted to write about it because I've just been seeing it on the ground anecdotally. You know, I've been going around the country for, I guess, 4 years now, talking about the woke movement and how it affects families in particular. That's kind of the intersection of my interest, is how does ideology affect the family? And I noticed that at Q&A, I had one question or comment every single time. And it would be somebody would stand up and say, my adult children or my adult grandchildren they've left the faith. They barely talk to me. They, you know, kind of don't value any of the things that I've tried to pass along to them. And sometimes we're completely estranged, you know, so that was, it was a spectrum of our relationship is very strained. I have to tiptoe around my kids or they've cut me off altogether. So I just thought, you know, gosh, what is happening? I'm seeing this anecdotally. And then, so connected with, agent editor and got the book, set up. But yeah, meanwhile, all these articles have exploded. So it just seems like this is an urgent, maybe new, crisis the family is facing that I think is, only going to play out in more escalating ways as time goes on.
I think the project that you're undertaking is incredibly important. And I think it affects everyone because whether we are in that family system where this estrangement or ideological tension is happening, or we know people. I think pretty much everyone now knows someone who somebody wouldn't talk to somebody, or somebody didn't have someone over for dinner, or something happened to break down otherwise typical bonds because of ideology. So I'm very excited to dive in. For those that though aren't familiar yet with your work, give us more about Noelle, your background, what got you interested in all of this?
Yeah.
Whatever else you want to share.
I've been married for 26 years. We have 6 children. Our first grandchild, our daughter, grandchild, Evangeline, who's the cutest. So we've got 3 still at home.
That's crazy. You have grandkids, Noelle.
What's that?
That's crazy. You have a grandchild. That's
it's
crazy.
Awesome. It is awesome.
Congrats.
I mean, everyone says it's great, and it truly is. So I was a stay-at-home mom for most of that time, and then started dipping my toe into various projects, and started writing around 2017, 2018. And then that turned into, I connected with an old friend, Carrie Gress, I went to Franciscan with.
We've had her on the show, folks.
She's been on the show. That's right. Yep. So, we started the Theology of Home, the book series, which is now 4 books, and a website, a shop, original content. So, that's been great. And we found an institutional home at EPPC, Ethics and Public Policy Center, where we co-direct the Theology of Home project. But they're very supportive of all of our extra work too. I mean, the ideology, the no contact book. So, all of that is housed with EPPC, which is great. We have amazing colleagues. So it's just, that's slowly taken more and more of my time, writing, speaking, working on TOH, and talking to great people like you. So it's been a great blessing. I mean, I think I've always been passionate about how our beliefs affect the way we live and how it affects, culture war issues, which I think that term gets kind of denigrated, but it's actually, they're really important issues, and the denigration is maybe part of kind of undermining their value, but they affect us deeply, and people are interested in them for good reasons, because they tend to work out in very personal ways in our lives and unfold in various ways. So yeah, that's kind of been the heart of my work. And sometimes people say, oh, you write about the woke movement, but then you write about home. And I think those are 2 sides of one coin in a way, right? I mean, we have to both critique what is attacking the family, but also, uplift and value, and kind of maybe give a vision for what ought to be.
Yeah. And you're out here in California.
Ventura.
Okay, you're in Ventura. So, from what I understand of your world, which is kind of adjacent to my world, this whole space of Southern California, you have like this deep faith and people that are building schools and institutions and businesses, and certainly families, parishes, who are just on fire for values and faith and timeless truth. And then you're surrounded by, the, attitudes of the age, and also like California, and you've got like Hollywood over there, and then up north at Silicon Valley and big tech. And there are these ideologies that are particularly, I would say, vicious, that can originate or at least find special life and power. So I think about Gavin Newsom when he was the mayor of San Francisco. California, via ballot, votes to make marriage clear as one man and one woman. So gay marriage, marriage is naturally a one man, one woman. Any other union is not a marriage. You can have other unions, but those are not marriages. They don't get the special rights of marriages, privileges, and responsibilities of marriage. Anyways, Gavin Newsom, who's now our governor, was the mayor of San Francisco, and he actually violated that order and was giving out marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Like this was like his big event that he staged. So anyways, I say all that to say, do you think your experience of being in California, how do you think that's affected the way that you view between your faith, your values, and then this kind of state that we're in, where like the culture war is very much here? How has that shaped you, how you see things, and also your interest in even getting involved? As a stay-at-home mom, you're very involved. You're writing books, you're on the speaking circuit, like you're out there.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure it's affected me in ways that I'm unaware. I mean, when I go to talk to friends in more red states, they'll say, we tend to be a little bit more complacent, and our California friends tend to be pretty galvanized. And I think that's probably a product of as you're saying, just being here. And another nice thing that I like about being in California is I've always had lifelong dear friendships with people who are very progressive and outside the faith, and, think very differently than I do. And I think that that's always been something that has made this sort of writing, particularly in a mission of mine, is that it's, I see the viciousness of the ideology, and I also see the dear hearts of some of the people who are consumed by it and maybe brought into it. And so that kind of makes me want to write about it with strength, but also with a lot of love because of the people that I'm thinking of, that it's not an abstraction. those relationships have always been very important to me. And I think I've always kind of prided myself on being able to maintain them. And it changed a little bit in 2020. I'm sure that's, and so this is one of the reasons why I think the no contact book is interesting, is because it's not just, I'm primarily writing about kids and their parents, but we've all had friendships that have gotten really strained, right, over the last 5 years. And so that's been a real test of how are we going to maintain kind of unity amongst difference, and, not just in a microcosm of one particular friendship or community, but as a country, how can we move forward, in the home, in the community, and in the country? And it seems like those are all connected in my mind.
It's 4th of July, you guys. Happy 4th of July. And now is the time to celebrate those American companies that we love and get the best sales. And that's why I'm so excited that Nimi Skincare, the brand that I use, the brand that I love, that has the best products, like the brightening day protection sunscreen here that I use every morning, and like the age-defying antioxidant moisturizer that I use every night. These products are 15% off today. You can go to nimiskincare.com and patronize this amazing company that supports our values. That's an American-based company, all products made in the USA, and you get a full 15% off your order today using the code, yes, freedom. I love Nimi because their approach is refreshingly simple and honest. You're getting clinically proven ingredients that actually work for your skin. I also love the fact that the Nimi skincare lines are simple. I'm a simple gal. I don't like a million products and having to sift through all of these different packages. With Nimi Skincare, it's a very simple line. You get a few products per line, and you can pick the one that works best with your skin type. And you can order any product on the Nimi website using the code FREEDOM and get a full 15% off your order. Do you think that the phenomenon of people going no contact is a consequence of the pandemic and the whole vaccine mandate stuff? Some people choosing to vax and not vax, and all the judgment that happened.
Yeah, I think that certainly escalated a lot of things. For one thing, people are much more able to be controlled when they are isolated. Isolation and anxiety makes people yearn for some sort of powerful figure to come down and on the enemies that they see are a threat to them. So whether that be the unvaccinated out there or, whatever, the people who don't believe the right things. Certainly the COVID times left a lot of people very isolated and alone, and anxious and scared. And, I think we have left people without sort of a foundation for contextualizing suffering. That was the biggest thing that was alarming to me, is that, my father passed away in 2022. And I remember the whole time at his bedside thinking, if I were doing this over FaceTime, which a lot of people did in 2020, 2021, I would want to stage a revolution at that point. It's so inhuman.
And what's so inhuman about it too is they're dying. And the risk of COVID is to whom?
Right.
It's like, are they going to die alone?
Yeah.
How's this? Who is this actually helping or serving?
And dying is not the worst.
Yes.
It's not the most inhuman thing. We need to balance, the medical necessities with real human needs, which are to be with each other and to be with our loved ones, to console them. And meanwhile, you're thinking, okay, so I guess this is a virus that I can catch at the playground and at my child's therapy, physical therapy appointment, but I can't catch it in, a bar or in a strip club or at a BLM protest. There are all these arbitrary places you could go and places you couldn't go. You can't go to church, but you can go here. It's just insane.
The abortion clinics were open.
Right. Exactly.
That just blew my mind.
Yeah.
The churches were closed and the abortion clinics stayed open.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the absolute injustice of it combined with the censorship. It just was a time. And so I think, it sorted people, it sorted people where people were really scared and isolated and really ready to be angry at someone. And then a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, this is massive overreach of power. How can we be succumbing to this? So, it made people, I think it created a lot of division.
What has been the most tragic story that has caught your eye with regard to Gen Zers, younger people going no contact over ideology with their own loved ones, especially their parents?
Yeah. There's one story. So I've been interviewing a ton of families, and one story sticks out in my mind of this dear father and mother and their daughter. She had already always had some comorbidities, some anxiety, some mental health stuff. And she got captured by kind of a really alternative group and was online a lot. And,
online, like on the
online.
internet.
Yeah. And that, parents have all sorts of regrets, of course, but,
how old was she? Sorry.
She was about 16 when this started.
Okay.
Yeah. And then she came out as gay, and then she came out as transgender. But she was just having fits of rage, even before starting testosterone. Testosterone can put you into fits of rage, but she was already sort of in that place, very highly emotionally reactive, real black and white thinking, entitled, the three signs of, kind of mental pathologies. And she, their parents really tried to accompany her. At one point, the last time he talked to her, she looked at him and basically gave him an ultimatum, said, your Catholic faith or me. I can't believe you choose your religion over me, your daughter, or your son, at that point. And he said something to the effect of, I love you, but I also am not going to leave our Lord. And he realized that, she was asking him, it was a moment of apostasy. That he was being presented with a moment of apostasy. And I think, we always think that would come, at the end of a gun, in some sort of war or some, a political prisoner. To have it be coming from the person to whom you're most, beholden to protect and the person you most care about in the world, presenting you with that choice, is wild and rather diabolical. And, one of the things I realize is that these parents are really, particularly with the gender, the parents are really an existential threat to their identity. First of all, they have an unstable identity. Gender fluidity is by definition unstable identity. But as parents, you have a canon of memory for your child that they don't have for themselves. I remember when my children were 1 or when they were newborn, they don't remember that. And so they're, our memory for our kids is more comprehensive than their own. And so we can pretend like we're going along with a change in identity, but they know that we are a reminder of an identity that just won't die. And so I think parents will always be a threat, particularly for these poor kids who are gender confused.
Where do you make the distinction between there are abusive parents that exist? There are narcissistic parents that exist. There are, boundaries that are healthy that some children should have with especially adult children, I should say, should have with their parents, right? And so how do you discern, and I know you're exploring this in the book, but how do you discern between a healthy boundary and then an ideological no contact, or let's call it a healthy boundary versus an ideological boundary, actually. Maybe use that framework to keep it simple. How do you discern that?
It's such an important question. So I'm making a big point of the book to say, if your parents are abusive, there are situations where going no contact is the right and healthy choice. And what
would be those situations, by the way?
Well, the historical reasons are abuse, a divorce oftentimes leads to no contact for sometimes just and sometimes less just reasons. Mental illness, severe addictions. This is historically why in modern West people have gone no contact with parents. If you go back further in the history, which I do, there's always been some sort of version of kind of family estrangement, banishing a relative. And oftentimes, the thing that changed is that historically it was always for the sake of preserving some sort of societal cohesion. So maybe somebody is, a live wire. He's a vicious person, or he's dangerous, or he's a threat to the community. He might, be put in prison or banished in, older times for good or for ill, or commits treason or something. Or if, someone is severely addicted to something and, it's too threatening.
They're dangerous.
Yeah. But something switched, particularly in the 20th century when, the rise of ideologies, the type of family estrangement, and they weren't even calling it that, but that's what it was, became ideological, meaning it changed in two particular ways. One, it was directed from the younger towards the older. And secondly, the big change was that it was, not for the sake of preserving unity, but for the sake of the interruption of that relationship. It was for the sake of changing the culture in a revolutionary utopian way. So like in Chairman Mao would say, we have to get rid of the four olds, old religion, old ideas, old culture, old habits or whatever. But old people were part of that. And so they had all of these, the Chinese youth movement that were part of the Communist Party, they had them, denounce their parents on stage in front of a bunch of people.
That's so crazy.
And that was, for, replacing the loyal familial piety with piety to the state, to Chairman Mao. He became both the spiritual leader and the father leader. And I think we're seeing something similar to that now. It's not in that dramatic way. It's more it's viral, I would say now. So it's coming from the individual himself. It's not like someone's coming to a kid and saying, hey, you should cut off your parents. But it is all over TikTok. You know, there's what I call TikTok psychologists, and like the hashtags toxic parents, narcissistic parents. I mean, these are all over, with tons of views. And I think, you know, there's something really appealing to once you elevate kind of, the identity of woundedness as being something that kind of gives you a platform and an importance and explains away maybe some sufferings that you have in your life or some ways you haven't been able to thrive. You start looking at your history for a culprit for that. And parents are kind of a natural place to put that. And so if you've got all of these viral kind of influencers talking to you to, you know, this really freed me. I walked away from my family and it's amazing. I feel fantastic now. And then they have like quizzes, you know, were your parents not there for you in an important moment? Did your parents ever kind of withhold affection from you? This is called the Barnum effect. It's this phenomenon where generalized statements you can think applies to you personally. It's like fortune cookies or like horoscopes or, you know, so they will conflate sort of like abuse with very simple kind of normal, maybe parenting failures. You know, I mean, we're all going to fail our kids at some point or another, hopefully not in grand, horrible, traumatic ways, but you know, I might be busy one day and not realize this kid has got his feelings hurt and I'm not giving them proper attention. Then I can, once I find out, I can apologize for that. But, you know, for them but for kids, they can easily look back in their history, find those moments and then kind of explode them in their memory to be, you know, a source of something wrong with their life now. And I think that's a human temptation.
WeHeartNutrition.com is a vitamin and supplement company that provides the highest quality, research-backed ingredients, customized and optimized to help you be healthy. What I also love about We Heart Nutrition is that this is a family-owned company, and they donate a full 10% back of all of their revenue to pregnancy resource centers to help moms and babies in need. So whether you are premenopausal or postmenopausal, whether you're looking to conceive, help improve your fertility, whether you're pregnant, and this is a great prenatal vitamin, or you're postnatal. Plus, I'm very excited to share this with my husband. Now We Heart Nutrition has come out with their first line of men's vitamins. And if you order today at WeHeartNutrition.com, get your vitamins, you can get 20% off using the code Lila. And if you spend at least $50, you will get a free signature bamboo capsule vitamin box. So go to WeHeartNutrition.com today. Use the code Lila at checkout to get 20% off your purchase. That's WeHeartNutrition.com. There's so many questions I want to have based on what you said. It's very fascinating stuff because on the one hand, you're talking about the fact that, if I'm understanding you correctly, based on your research, this idea of the youth rejecting the elderly as opposed to revering the elderly and caring for the elderly and seeing them as wise sages to guide the future, right? And the youth are rebellious and all over the place, but are not even rebellious. The youth are just needing the guidance, right? Yeah. That something fairly unique to the 20th century is that you had this switch where instead of the elderly being revered and wisdom being revered, it's now this really cult of youth. And I think there has always been a cult of youth to some degree, like admiration for youth and its beauty and everything else. But it now became about sort of the leadership power of youth. And exactly right. You mentioned the Cultural Revolution in China and Mao and this whole rejection of old. We want the new. We had Dr. Ming Wang on the show who grew up in communist China. And he was talking about how he experienced this firsthand where they literally rounded up all the people who were college educated and sent them off to the rural parts of China and refused to let them do any meaningful, intelligent work or even build I mean, they had to they lost a whole generation of of people with skills, special intelligence, good education. They just destroyed that because they were, I think, too liberal in terms of, not communist. They weren't propagandized to be in the communist mold, and they needed to do that very intentionally, and they hadn't done that with that cohort, so they just shipped them off to the countryside. Anyways, very fascinating stuff, like how you engineer populations. But is that your sense of it, that this idea of the youth being the wiser ones, the youth rejecting the older ones, the old ones throwing them away, that's a very modern thing? Like, you don't really see much of that throughout human history. Yeah, I love the way you described it. I mean, it's very ideological and very modern, right? So I think that that's exactly right. I mean, it's re-engineering society takes kind of a culture of forgetting. That you want to interrupt and then you want to forget. You don't want a unity with what's come before you. Either in the
the path of history, you want to be on the next thing, right? If you want to be at the right side of history, you want to be at the very end, the first to revolutionize the most. It creates this sort of hastening of the future, and a hastening to transgress. I mean, a big part of this is, a inversion of the fourth commandment, you honor thy father and thy mother, which is the only commandment that has a promise so that you can live long and flourish in the land our Lord has given you. So I think, in other words, that there's some civic kind of implication to disregarding that commandment. And the interesting thing is that not only are we disregarding it, it really is an inversion. So there's a lot of common scripts amongst the no contact community. And one of the things that they will say is that, you chose to have me. I did not choose to be born. And so you owe me everything. I don't owe you anything. And, you hear in this language, they'll say, I didn't consent to my life. I didn't consent to being born. And one therapist I heard actually said this phrase, which totally jolted me, but he said, it's true. If you inflict life on unsuspecting flesh, you owe it a lot. And I was like, gosh, that sounds like sexual assault. Doesn't it? Imagine like the gift of life. You're giving somebody their life, and I'm not going to be grateful for it. I'm going to see that as a burden, right? It's not a blessing. It's a burden. And you did this to me. You inflicted life on unsuspecting flesh. And so, it's a recasting of what the role of the parent is.
And the point of life.
And the point of life.
Life is inherently, it's nihilistic. It's nihilism.
That's right. That's
life
right.
Life is inherently not good.
That's right. And one of the consequences is that those young adults then who bought into this philosophy, that's language of consent, which is basically meaning, consent there's a lot to that. It's a reflection of an autonomous understanding of the human person that has no moral language for any action except for, is it consent? Did I consent to it? Anything goes if I consented. Which actually prohibits any ability to contextualize when we've made bad choices and we suffer from them. If I consented and then I'm suffering from it, I consented, so it must have been fine. So who is to blame here? And it makes you look outside again. But anyway, my point was going to be the young adults who have adopted this language, I did not choose to be born. They are not moving into parenthood. And it makes perfect sense, because if parenthood, by their own definition and framework, is something that's not honorable, it's not noble, it's just a lot of work, and you might end up isolated and rejected at the end of it by your adult children.
In your own childhood, and you're like, look at all the mistakes they made anyways.
Yeah. Why would you want to move into that category? And so I think it really explains a lot about why these young adults are not moving into the category of parenthood. I just listened to this interview of this beautiful Israeli director. She's a documentarian. And she was talking about why she's not had children to an older woman who's was her friend's mom. And the woman said, when you have children, it makes you less spontaneous. You have to look at someone else's priorities and put them above your own. And she was saying these things that are about generosity. And the woman kind of laughed, and the young woman laughed, and she said, you're making the case for why I don't want to be a mom. And then the older woman said, don't you think that's a little bit, there's a tish of selfishness to that? And she immediately went on to kind of like, almost like a sanctimonious moment. Like she said, we think that it's actually selfish to have children because this world is really horrible and there's a lot of suffering. And, I tell my parents all the time, I did not ask to come into this world. So, so you can see how not only does it make parenthood unappealing, it also gives a moral cover for it, for rejecting it altogether.
So dark.
It really is. It really is.
It's so dark, and it's the abortion ideology too.
Yeah.
Like, it's better to not be born. It's better to not exist.
That's right.
Existence itself is a curse.
That's right.
And even the people that, like, the parents happily chose for them to be born are now regretting it, or they're thinking, I got to make the most of this, but I'm not going to bring children into the world now.
Yeah.
For any number of reasons. Yeah. This is an article exactly with what you're describing. This is CNBC, but neither of us feel interested. More Americans don't want kids, and it's not just because of money. And this is a review of these different perspectives, saying this one young woman was looking at other single people in their 30s and 40s, and it's like, oh, that looks like fun. Why would I have a child? And it remarks about the U.S. fertility rate, which I know you've spoken about and talked about. The U.S. fertility rate is 1.6 births per woman, which is cataclysmic in terms of future repercussions economically and socially, because you need 2.1 children minimum per woman to reproduce, to continue the population. The only reason we're not totally destroying ourselves is because of immigration.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of it is built around this framework of choice. My colleague in DC actually just sent me a sign outside of a fast fashion department store, and the sign said, "Chosen families, infinite love," which I thought, I've never heard of something that could be both so banal and deranged, but chosen families is another big part of this. So that's another common thing they'll talk about.
What is a chosen family?
Chosen families has its history in LGBTQ culture. So, young men would run away and live in these homes in, San Francisco or something. They would create their family with a mom and a dad and a cousin and siblings. And, it's all men. Chosen families can be benign and even good. If you think about, everyone has experience where good friendships become like family, we were so close that you're actually my family. That can be a sweet thing. And it can also be a vital thing when somebody has a family crisis and needs to create new community. But it also is an ideological thing. So it's really kind of exploding now where a lot of the no contact kids are talking about, thank goodness I have my chosen family. The father I mentioned earlier, the first thing he saw, his daughter posted on social media, that she was coming out and that she has a chosen family. And it's this, even if we are not going to extremes with it, it's still an ideology that affects us all. For example, I think about family life. Family is a given, right? I don't choose who I'm born to. I don't choose my siblings. My kids are kind of stuck with their siblings. Even though we choose our spouse, there can be a givenness that enters into marriage where, it's a given that you're near me, and next to me or whatever. But the magic family life is choosing what is given. I'm going to choose you again every day. Even though that choice was years ago, I choose you again. And then even for my kids, I think, when they have a friend come over, it's tempting to be like, oh, I've got my friend, get away, siblings, you don't play with us. But I encourage them, choose to include your sibling. That is the loving thing to do. And when that starts to happen, we have stability. We have, love. We have bonding. If our relationships are all built on choice, they're unstable. And if they're all built on givenness, they're impersonal, right? And so we need to really reunify those ideas. And one of the fascinating things that's happened is that I was, this man he had a chosen family. He rejected his parents, chose his family. And this was 20 years ago. He was ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. And he said, he wrote honestly about it. And he said, chosen family is great when you're young and good looking and capable. I'm getting old now. People are kind of walking away from me. I need more. I'm vulnerable. My body's breaking down. I'm not good looking anymore. I've gained whatever. And he realized, you need people who are obligated to you. You need real family. You don't, chosen family can't really sustain us. And so these re-engineering utopian ideologies that think that we can rework all of ourselves out of this old construct of family life, it's not successful. It always ends up in the same way with total tragedy and disaster. And we're just repeating that again.
We just had Beckett Cook on the show, and he is sort of, I don't know if he uses this exact language, but it's certainly connected to his book and everything in his life, ex-gay. So he lived the gay life, and he was this, from a Catholic family, youngest of 8 kids, kind of left, went to LA, did his own thing, lived this other life, and then he had a big conversion. And part of the impetus for that big conversion is he was getting older. And he looked around at his life, which was fun. He hung out with all these big famous people in Hollywood and creative and interesting and artistic, and like the depth he was hungry for, like something deeper, more than like their cool, fun pursuits. Like family was another part of that. And then also he felt this sense of what's my future going to hold, because he made this joke when we were talking that the, gay men of LA, when they get older, they're put out to pasture in Palm Springs. I think was the language that he used. I was like, it's very funny. But it's a real phenomenon of like, well, who's going to care for me? Yeah. Who's going to be there for me? By nature, it's a naturally sterile relationship unless you adopt or, use some reproductive technologies, but like, you're not fruitful. You're not building families. There's not a mother and a father. And I think because of all the woundedness people experience from broken families, divorce culture of the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and beyond, sexual revolution, people can come up with enough reasons to say, I reject that. Like I reject my parents' way of doing things. I reject the way they hurt me. I reject. But it's like, okay, well, what are you going to build now? Yeah. What's your superior plan? Right. To all the old ways. Oh, yeah. And there's just total chaos right now. Yeah. Yeah. 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company on a mission to fund the pro-life movement and help moms and babies in need. My favorite is the Ethiopia medium roast. Its notes are smooth, chocolate, and floral. It is absolutely delicious. You have all kinds of blends available on the 7weeks.com website. What I love about this coffee is it is from the top 1 or 2% of beans in the world, and it's also mold-free, pesticide-free, ultra-low acid, and organically farmed. And this is where you and I come in. Not only can we subscribe to 7 Weeks Coffee and get the most delicious coffee delivered right to our door, we know that with every single purchase we make at 7 Weeks Coffee, they are donating a full 10% to pregnancy resource centers in need. And they have donated almost $1 million. You can actually help them get over the $1 million mark by ordering your coffee from 7 Weeks today. Go to 7weekscoffee.com today. Subscribe and save a full 15% off your order. And when you use the code Lila, you get an additional 10% off your first order. That's a full 25% off your first order at 7weekscoffee.com, and you'll also get a free gift. Order today and help fuel the pro-life movement.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is kind of on a different note, but I just co-led a pilgrimage to Poland with Father Dave Pivonka, and we went to Auschwitz. I'd never been there.
Wow. How was that?
Oh my gosh. I mean, seeing Maximilian Kolbe's cell was so striking to me. I mean, first of all, the stories, and so I didn't know the full extent of how he died, but I was struck by, they've got a candle in there too from when JP2 visited in a plaque. And I was, praying in front of it. And I thought, every utopian ideology promises heaven, and they turn this world into hell. And our Lord takes undeniable hell and injects heaven right into it through love, right? Through this saint, through the grace that is on offer. But wow, it was such a juxtaposition. I mean, seeing like this is a site of absolute hell, but a saint was made here. People are converted from that, the witness of that saint, that martyr. No one remembers the name of the commandant who put him to death, but everyone remembers St. Maximilian Kolbe. How many people have converted because of him that we don't even know about,
Tell a story. I mean, for folks listening, a lot of people might know, but can you?
Yeah. So,
what did you learn that was new that you didn't realize? Because I'm sure had heard of him before.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
a big saint from World War II. What did you learn that was new by going to Auschwitz and seeing the place where he was killed?
Yeah. Well, so he was a Franciscan friar, priest. He was really amazing. I mean, he had a radio show. He had a huge reach. He was very influential. He was, a priestly influencer of the time. I didn't know that. That was one of the things that surprised me. So he was arrested, put in Auschwitz, and
for what?
Political dissident, I guess. I could be wrong.
He was a Christian.
Yeah,
he wasn't Jewish.
Christian, right? He wasn't Jewish,
but he
Catholic
sided
priest.
too much with the Jews, basically, and criticized
he was
the
speaking
regime.
out. He was an influential person, and of course, Christianity is always an enemy to utopian ideology. So he's arrested. A prisoner attempts an escape, and so the commandant decides to make an example out of him by then just picking 10 prisoners to die in starvation, in a starvation cell. So he picks 10. One of the 10 starts crying out for his wife and children, saying, "I'm a father, I'm a husband." And so Maximilian Kolbe steps in front. He said, "Let me take his place." And he said, the commandant said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm a Catholic priest," which I kind of love that he didn't say his name or, he just said, "This is who I am. It's my identity." And so by the grace of God, he's allowed to take the place. I mean, the commandant could have said no, and they're put in a starvation cell. And about day 16,
the
starving.
Could have also killed them both.
That's true.
It's such a risk, right?
Yeah. The fact that he let this moment of love and it's amazing.
But it's such a risk that Maximilian Kolbe offered himself.
Yeah.
Because he might not even have been able to save that guy's life.
That's right. That's right.
And just like he was throwing his life to the wind, but there was a chance of saving the guy's life and he took the chance.
That's right. It gives me chills. So on day 16, I think 6 of the prisoners had died of starvation. There are 4 left. I could be wrong, but something like that. And they're, in this hellish environment. And the guards are sick of hearing St. Maximilian Kolbe sing his love of God. He was singing
the Liturgy of the Hours.
He's singing Liturgy of Hours, Psalms. Yeah, beautiful. So they came in and they injected him this is the part I didn't know, in his heart with chemicals that, and he lifted his arms to make it easier on them. And I mean, it just disintegrated his body, but, so there's nothing left of him, but he had a barber who had a strange sense that this was a very holy man, and he saved some of his hair. So there is a relic of him, which is wild. But yeah, so anyway, I know I took us on a totally different tangent, but it's been part of my prayer life ever since, to seeing that was so striking. And the juxtaposition of, social reengineering, what they promise, what they deliver, what Christ promises and also delivers, they could not be more opposite. the inversion. And then, the whole situation was a lie that St. Maximilian Kolbe was in. And he took that inversion and with Christ, he righted it, and by injecting love into it. It's beautiful.
Why is it so important to honor thy father and thy mother? Why does that commandment exist?
Good question.
That you and your future generations should prosper is the rest of the
Well, that's a part of it. I think there's also a lot of natural reasons. So we are practicing being obedient to authority and imperfect authority, right? And that's an important skill to learn. I mean, even on a practical level, that we might have to obey things that we don't necessarily agree with or don't quite understand. And God rightly gives us from the time we're small, someone to kind of direct that obedience towards. But also someone who loves us personally, right? So, I mean, the value of the power of the family is that it's benevolent authority in a well-ordered family. We have this false dichotomy in society where we think of all authority is collapsed into authoritarianism. So if you think about there being authority or hierarchy or anything, we think immediately, oppression. It's not true. Proper authority is benevolent, right? It's for the sake of the good. It's commissioned from above. So a real leader, parents ought to be reverent to God himself and to be beholden for what they are creating in their home. So I think kids, are given that as a instruction into the realm of authority and also as, a microcosm of being in a relationship with a good and loving father, God himself. That is, how we are introduced to that sort of fatherly love, motherly love, which are, two expressions of God's nature. And so, learning to serve and obey and is an introduction into reverence, into wonder. It's an introduction into there's some things in this life that are veiled that I don't totally understand, but I'm going to honor them.
And I don't have full control.
And I don't have full control. Will. Yeah. Yeah. So it's, incredibly important. And I think there's a lot of chaos. I oftentimes think we'll say, cultural revolutions turn every member of the family into its opposite. So men tend to become weak. And a sexual revolution makes men very weak. St. Thomas Aquinas says that effeminacy is the inability to endure what is arduous for the sake of what is good. So the strong man is the virtuous man, the holy man. It tends to make women hardened, right? Because we have a nature that is too valuable and vulnerable to endure the traumas of the sexual revolution. And so like a callus, we can tend to create a hard shell around ourselves when we're wounded, unprotected, all these things, used, whatever. And I think this is another type of inversion where children become the authoritarians over their parents. The parents become like the child. I just watched this one video of this granddaughter and she's interviewing her grandfather and she's, asks him his name, asks him who he voted for. He voted wrong. And she just begins excoriating him like she's a dictator, authoritarian father. Yes, authoritarian father. Like she just starts saying, I have talked to you for so long about this. I have tried to educate you. I cannot, it's wild. It's wild. It went
I've seen those TikTok videos though.
Oh yeah. And, we can say that they're extreme, but they speak into a logic that's real, that there's really is an authoritarianism that's risen on the left. In fact,
sorry, I'll just quick interject. I noticed this theme of I need to educate you.
Yeah.
Or worse, even you need to educate yourself. It's not my job to educate you.
Right.
I'm superior in my ideology. Your ideology is bigoted, wrong, hateful, whatever title they want to put on it. I'm not even going to engage you because you're below me.
That's
like
right.
Truly. So go figure it out. It's not my responsibility
That's right.
to educate you. As if A, you are actually right and they're wrong. B, they need to be educated. C, they need to go. There's so many implications there.
Yeah.
It's horribly condescending.
Yeah. Do the work. Yeah. Do the work. Yeah. So some of the stuff I've been researching lately, it's fascinating that, oftentimes this is coming from the left. Far more than it's coming from the right. And there's some good reasons for that. So, one of them being that the leftists for a long time had built into their ideology a real blind spot to their own possibility of their ability to be authoritarians. So, some social psychologists call this the Loch Ness monster theory, where they say, people talk about left-wing authoritarianism, but there's no evidence for it. We don't really see it. It's just a figment of our imagination. It's really a right-wing phenomenon. And this has a long history. Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, they wrote, Theodor Adorno wrote the F scale, the fascist scale. How do we know if someone's a fascist? And some of the traits were respect for authority. I want to preserve certain hierarchies, or respect for fatherhood, I think was one, just pathologized sort of things that tend to be more conservative beliefs. But then, the 90s, these social psychologists said, it really is a phenomenon purely of the right. There have been some groundbreaking studies in the last 10 years-ish. One coming out of Emory University, one from a social psychologist, Luke Conway, and he was in Montana. Now he thinks he's at Grove City. But they really exposed the Loch Ness theory as being itself a fiction. So, but it's the fascinating thing is that where right-wing authoritarianism tends to follow those kind of traits I mentioned, respect for hierarchy, left-wing authoritarianism tends to want to break down any hierarchy. It tends to want top-down censorship, however, which is in its own way a type of hierarchy, an authoritarian one. And it tends to, whereas the right wing wants to is resistant to change, the left wing authoritarianism manifests itself in a celebration of transgressive behavior. So, but because the ideals of the left believe that they are anti-fascist, they are anti-fascism, anti-authoritarianism, that sort of baptizes all of their behavior in the social psychology as being justifiable. And so it's a real blind spot. So
they're saying they're being authoritarian in the name of fighting authoritarians.
Yeah. But they don't even think that behavior is authoritarian. So they're much more prone to political violence, for one thing. This is what the studies say. And much less able to identify. Like right-wing people who are involved in this study they were able to say, I think I have a tendency maybe towards authoritarianism. The left, the more authoritarian they were, the less likely they were to say that they were.
So you're saying the left, they lack self-awareness about their own issues.
They tend to, according to the studies. But now, one good news that Luke Conway points out is that he says, there is a seed of hope in here, which is because they are by sort of in principle anti-authoritarian, once they sort of see it, they become very motivated to resolve it on their own side. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. Barry Wise, there's been Bill Maher, there's a lot of people who have been very progressive who are starting to say, what are we doing?
So you're saying honest progressives. Actually have a great appetite for self-correction.
Exactly.
Provided it's clear to them that they know what to correct, and then they'll go to town.
Yeah. They have to sort of see it. And then once they see it, they tend to be really good and motivated to correct it.
And for all the follies of Me Too, right? Mm-hmm. And by the follies, I mean, going too far excesses. The other direction, let's say excesses of Me Too. Yeah, is a better term. Like believe all women versus, well, let's generally speaking, like pay attention to, these concerns and like reform, sexual abuses, whatever, right? But Harvey Weinstein, he was a leftist dream boy. I mean, he was like patronizing all the leftist causes. He was friends with all the leftist politicians. He wasn't like some raging conservative that they're like, finally, we have a reason to get rid of him.
Right.
So I think that now you can get into the argument of he was clearly involved in very sleazy behavior. Is even the dynamics of the legal battle against him fully fair? Meaning, what was consented to versus not? We could have all those discussions, but the point still stands, to your point, that they outed him happily because they were doing a self-correction with there being sexual abuse and, bad sexual behaviors and everything in Hollywood. Now, what's ironic about that is there's still horrible sexual behaviors in Hollywood, but they just have the veneer of consent. Like, we're all consenting to this. I'm the intimacy coordinator for the shoot. So we're going to do pornographic stuff. Like, it's super abusive, but we're all enjoying ourselves, right? It's just disgusting, right? So I don't know that we've necessarily reformed Hollywood after Me Too. I don't think we have.
Right. Well, they don't have the right moral. I mean, there's not a framework to really do the deep reform. It needs to be some sort of conversion or something, I think, oftentimes, or either intellectual conversion or spiritual conversion. Because the language of consent simply is just not, it's too reductive. It can't make comprehensive sense out of the whole scope of moral wounds and hurts and abuse that can happen amongst people.
Right. So what would be, in your research so far, you're seeing this trend, you're seeing it sort of blindside parents. It sounds like a lot of parents like, I don't know what to do with this. What are some of the other stories you're hearing about the experiences of parents right now?
Yeah.
And it increasing in the last few years.
Yeah. Well, so we talked a lot about the gender stuff. So the three main things I'm seeing is gender, voting, and COVID stuff. So several stories of couples who wouldn't allow their families to come to their wedding if they didn't get, the shot. One was featured in the New Yorker, I believe. Yeah.
Featured for not allowing their family to come to their wedding.
Yeah. Yeah. And, some of these families are trying to do whatever they can. They're saying, well, we'll self-isolate, they're trying everything. It's
over the vax.
It's so ideological at that point. It's not really, it doesn't make sense. But the other is voting. So, I just spoke with this lovely woman, and her son, she knew he was on the progressive side. And so they really didn't talk about it much and amongst the siblings. And, it was not a point of contention, but he just became irate after the last election and, put it on social media. I believe that my family voted for this person. I'm thinking about calling them and screaming. And sure enough, she got a phone call and he was irate and she said, I voted for someone I thought was would have more pro-life policies. That's all. That was the point of my vote. And he said, well, you should not have voted at all. And she realized at one point this wasn't going anywhere. And she said, I love you. And he said, I love you too. And then he won't speak to her anymore nor his siblings. But so, that's a big thing that's happening now. I mean, that's been written about a lot of, and this has been really normalized. I think looking back on like the Obama administration. Do you remember Pajama Boy? It was this campaign that the Obama administration put out. It was leading into the holidays, and they had this hipster young man in pajamas, and he was saying, "This Christmas, wear PJs, drink hot chocolate, and talk about healthcare policy." And then in the Biden administration, they had something else where the Biden administration put out talking points about, how to talk to your uncle, your conservative uncle, about abortion, and how to, pass the potatoes. Let's talk about how we need abortion in our state. I mean, it's nuts. But the strange thing was that, I don't remember any administration before kind of putting it right in the heart of the family like that before. Like, you're going to go at your family dinner table and you're going to make this an issue, a wedge.
And your political talking points.
Yeah. And sort of leveraging the young to talk to the older people who are ignorant, So in some ways, we're seeing the fruits of those sorts of, this has been a long time. And at some point, in some ways, those campaigns were a little bit mocked and derided. But they were onto something that they knew was coming, and you would be a way to kind of that the young would be their next constituency that would really kind of either correct the elders or just become more militant.
Part of your book and research is looking at how people can respond.
Yeah.
On a more practical level to this growing phenomenon. And I think there's a takeaway for the parents listening, quite frankly, or grandparents. But there's also, I think, just a disposition that anybody needs to have to this, because it's happening to friends.
Yes.
It's less extreme when that happens. Like, oh, they unfriended me. Literally, they unfriended me.
Yeah.
I'm used to being unfriended back in the day because my pro-life work turned a lot of people off just because they're like so passionately for abortion. But it's much more painful when it's like a child and a parent than just like your friend. It can be all painful.
Oh yeah.
So what is the practical takeaways that you would recommend for people who are facing being iced out over their beliefs? Yeah.
Well, I mean, and friendship thing can be very painful too. I think, a lot of people have talked to me about that. Well, one of the hard things is that, particularly for moms, this can be eviscerating of their identity, right? And there's a lot of shame and secrecy around this topic, because a lot of parents think, who am I if I have been rejected by my own child, and just feel this deep sense of embarrassment or shame. And there's some murkiness there because, there are, as you said earlier, there really are some toxic parents. I truly believe a lot of these parents, they did what they could and they did it well, and that they didn't anticipate the strength of the ideology. One parent I talked to said, I think if it had been 10 years earlier or 10 years later, I would have been okay. 10 years earlier, all of this ideology would not have been so forceful on my kid. 10 years later, I would have been more aware. I just was at this sort of nexus where I didn't realize what was happening, and it was really strong. So, and, I do think that there's a lot of good parents who are feeling shame that ought not. And I think one thing that I will tell people is, it's confusing when you're in this much pain. One mom, she went to bed for 1.5 years, and finally her husband said, we need to move on with our life.
She went to bed, meaning she
said that.
in bed.
She stayed in bed, basically could barely get out of bed for a year and a half. She was so distraught. And grandchildren are in the mix too. So she's not seeing the grandchildren.
Frozen out from her grandkids.
Yeah. And this is
I can't imagine. It makes me want to
that's
cry.
not gender. That's, it's politics more.
So like because of how she voted, she's being rejected by her kids and she's not allowed to see her grandkids.
Yeah. And there's some other dynamics there. I think that politics were maybe more of a battle and maybe some other personality dynamics in the mix. But I mean, things that should have been surmountable. And that's the thing is that, part of the solution is, I think there's collective solutions. We need to be talking as a society about how we avoid this, and be preventative about it. How we build up families so that this does not become a thing and expose and defeat this ideology. And then there's personal remedies too. So, one thing I'll talk to parents about is that, it's going to feel confusing. You're going to be questioning yourself. You need some objective person you're talking to help you gain peace. They need peace. Sometimes parents will become desperate and they'll, make promises. I've talked to this one mom who she was very progressive and she always celebrated the transgender movement until it was her child. And then she got really freaked out because of all the medical, harm that could come. And her hesitancy was immediately sniffed out. And so she just started affirming. And she said, I won't pay for any of these surgeries. And then the kid kind of threatened estrangement. So she started paying for them. And I think, we have to figure out what lines we don't want to cross now instead of just kind of chasing a line and then crossing lines we wish we never had crossed. Christian parents often say, you have to, we need to speak truth and we need to speak it in great love, in the context of great love. I mean, a lot of times these kids are in a lot of pain. They're in a lot of confusion. They're maybe have been abused or there's, some ways in which they're wounded and they're searching for clinging to this identity in a way that is, desperate. And, one of the first things a parent can do is not panic, but just maybe ask questions. Say, how long have you been carrying this? And be curious, how can I help you in your suffering? How can I accompany you? I want to understand where you're coming from, not just be revolted or freaked out or, panicking. But also, never compromising the truth,
Do you think family members should use another person's pronouns if that's what they're insisting in order to maintain contact?
No. I think you should never use pronouns.
Or the new name.
I think that's a little bit more of a gray area because it's not as clear to me that that's necessarily a lie. I would have
they can have a preferred nickname.
Yeah. But I would never use pronouns. I mean, I just don't think we can never participate in a lie.
Because if you have a child who's I love you, but if you don't use my pronouns, I can't talk to you anymore because you're making me suicidal or whatever the narrative is, right?
Yep.
And the parent's oh shoot. How bad is this? Just use a pronoun just so I can maintain contact.
I totally understand that instinct, and I would guard against it. I mean, I think that...
I agree with you. I don't think you should tell a lie because it's not going to help them in the end. It is going to hurt them.
Right. I think that we have to be for them in a way that is even beyond what they might be how they might be presently for themselves. We might be more for them than they are for themselves, but we can't turn and reduce that into being for their destruction, right? And so, some parents, they make their highest priority maintaining contact. And I understand why they're doing that, but I don't think that can be the highest priority. I think that we have to love them to the point of being willing to even sacrifice that relationship, maybe temporarily, for the sake of loving them, more truly, more deeply, more honestly. There's all sorts of prudent and Holy Spirit driven ways that I think we should be letting, guiding our conversations and our interactions. Oftentimes I'll tell parents, they know what you think. We don't always have to be telling them what we think. Sometimes parents are constantly I'll email them this article. That will change their mind. Or I'll email them this story. And I get that. I would probably have that same instinct too, but sometimes that just makes them more defensive. They know what we think, we don't have to keep presenting it. We need to instead maybe shift the conversation and the relationship to, I want to affirm the deeper identity that I see in you, which is not reduced to this sin or this disorder or this whatever you think it is, or your political beliefs. It's something far deeper. Because these kids have unstable identities. I mean, we all can have unstable identities. Do we understand that we are identified by the love of God? I don't know. Sometimes maybe I think I'm identified by my sin or by whether or not I'm achieving something. We can create false identities for ourselves all the time. But this generation in particular, I think, has an unstable identity in two particular ways. One, they've been told that they have an immense amount of power, godlike power. They can discern what the meaning of sex is, what the meaning of their body is, what the meaning of the world is, what the meaning of family is. At the same time, they're told they have no power at all, that they are total victims of systemic forces that are outside of themselves. And so this is a really strange
Super
cognitive
confusing.
dissonance for a kid to grow up
When
with,
you
right?
frame it like that, that's a very good framing and clear framing. And yes, it's
I have all power and no power. I have power that I have control over things I don't have any control of. And then at the same time, I'm saying I have no control over things that are right in my wheelhouse, right? I can actually change I can make my life better. I can choose to do something different tomorrow. I can choose to, have a new struggle, have a new habit, work on a new virtue. But they're saying, the systemic forces have led to my life in being what it is. And then, so it's this, I think that's created a lot of cognitive dissonance in young people and also made them very prone to anxiety. They don't know who they are. And so I think that the parent has a particular opportunity to reaffirm the deeper identity that they ought to have.
What's some practical ways that a parent can do that?
Yeah.
In your view?
Well, I think making the relationship about something greater and bigger. So affirming the good that we see in them. There's always good that we can see and identify in another person. How about we have lunch and talk about that? How about I ask you how you're doing with your friendships? How's work going? What if I make the conversation about everything else in your life and not about this thing that we are locking heads about? I think those sorts of practical things. I think also maintaining a peace where the parent needs to assume the dignity and nobility of the parenting role, where I'm not desperate, I'm not needy, I'm not panicking. I've got peace. I love you. I'm here for you. Like the image of the prodigal father, who is there ready to run out and welcome you at any time that you want to come back. This therapist I talked to, Rachel Hack, she's great. She tells parents, set the table, meaning just be prepared. They might go off the reservation, but they know where it is and they know what kind of a welcome awaits them when they come back. So how can we be that, whether we're estranged or not, even if we just have a strained relationship? How can I let you know I'm always here for you? I will never abandon you. I love you. I love you too much to kind of support you in your sin. And we don't have to say it in those explicit words, but that's the disposition, right? I deeply love you and I want to carry your burdens with you. And I'm here for you as you want me to be. I'm not going to tolerate, abusive actions. A lot of these parents, their kids can be very abusive towards them. That sort of dignity and nobility that has peace, has their lines, but also has great love on offer.
What is your recommendation when it comes to some of the more complex family dynamics involving children? And I'm thinking actually in particular about families where there are young children and there's a desire to protect those young children. Like they belong to the family, the couple that has values. They're trying to raise their family with faith, let's say, right? And then there's close family members who are acting very dramatically out of line with the moral order. And they're promoting their behaviors. It's not like we're just doing it in the privacy of our home. Like they're promoting this sexual disorder or chaos or whatever it is. Do you have recommendations? Because that's the kind of the opposite side of freeze out. I was like, well, we need to have, our family needs boundaries with these relatives because they're so, into swinger culture, whatever it is, and they're open about it, and like we want to protect the innocence of our children. Have you come across that side of the equation and thoughts about how to deal with that in a way that's ultimately loving, peaceful?
Yeah. No, I interviewed one woman who, it's a little bit different situation, but her sister is sort of a raging alcoholic. And they used to go on vacations together. And for a time, and she has young kids. And, for a time she thought, I'm just going to pull back on this. And she was prayerful about it. She realized, you know what, I'm going to say, let's keep doing our vacations, but I'm also going to say, these are the things, that we need to not do. And, she said, I have to grit my teeth a bit and there's, some awkwardness. She's, still drinking a ton and, kind of can be swearing sometimes and she catches herself and tries to stop. But, this woman has just said, you can't, bring men home or, whatever it is. She gave her concrete things that were kind of boundaries, but she's still maintaining the relationship. And I think, we obviously can't allow harm to come to our kids. It's our prior obligation. I think that probably kids can handle more knowledge than we oftentimes think, that I was surprised my kids knew what, gay was before I realized that they knew it. And, even though they're, I think in some ways in very Catholic community, but the world is just the world. And so that's okay. We can have frank discussions with them about that. I think they can handle it. So I think letting them know things that are, they can handle, but also trying to figure out what's age appropriate and what behaviors are going to be too kind of scary, alarming disturbing that they should be really protected from. And that, that takes a lot of prudence and probably maybe some spiritual direction, because it's just a real chasm of behaviors. There's a real spectrum there of what is tolerable and what's not. And where that exact line is, I'm not quite sure. I think people need particular advisement.
Yep. You have a chapter about therapy and that you're working on. I know it's all being developed now, but you mentioned it a couple of times, but I'd love to hear more thoughts from you about it. This idea of lack of resilience. People are using this therapy speak to coming up with these terms to reflect reality for themselves, but it's not reality. They're the constant victim in this framework, and everybody's out to get them, and they have no responsibility, and everybody has responsibility. Speak more to how, and I think today, I don't know the numbers. I should try to pull this up, but let's look it up really quick. How many people are going to therapy today? I think it's like,
I think I know that. I think it's about 24%.
60 million adults in the United States have received treatment or counseling for mental health in the past year.
Yeah, there's about 1 in 4. I think. Well,
half of Gen Zers go to therapy.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
And it's interesting because I'm not against therapy on the show. We talk about therapy. It actually can be amazing.
Totally.
You can have really bad therapy though. That can hurt you. And hurt other people. And then you can also rely on therapy for things that you actually need friends for and like a faith for. So those are important distinctions, but what's your take?
That's right. Well, I think that it's something that statistics have jumped to the point of 2002. I think 7% of Americans were in therapy. 2022 is 24%, I believe. But that's a pretty intense leap. And the more we're talking about mental health, the less mentally resilient we are. And there's not necessarily a direct causation there. It can just be a correlation, but I do think the correlation is significant. And there's all sorts of parts to this. I mean, I've talked to a lot of therapists about there's a lot of gatekeeping in the accreditation of the therapy industry where, some therapists are saying, when I'm counseling kids who have gender dysphoria, I just try to get them to be non-binary because then they won't feel like they have to have surgery, and they don't feel like they can tell them, this isn't good for you. So they just say, you might not be a boy, you might just be a non-binary, and then you don't need surgery, but that's how, kind of silenced they are. So there is something there, but as you said, it can be immensely helpful, and there are amazing therapists out there too. So, I wouldn't want to make a blanket statement either. But part of this is, once you incentivize victim identities, you create, it's an insatiable desire to then identify yourself as one, right? Because we're all tempted to that. It's hard to look at ourselves honestly. It's really easy to deflect, and something's gone wrong. And I want to say, well, who made this happen? Whose fault is this? I mean, that's a human temptation. And this is why the church is so beautiful and wise, because the church is saying, well, why don't you every day examine your conscience? And why don't you, once we go to confession, and why don't you do a mea culpa in the mass? In other words, like the church knows we're tempted by this. And so it's constantly redirecting us to look at ourselves, and which makes paradoxically a more merciful society. Because once we're aware of the pollution in our own soul, we look with more merciful eyes upon the pollution in someone else's soul, or the apparent pollution. But so once we remove sort of that scaffolding and then inject an incentive to become a victim, it's really tantalizing. And so, then you create this social media scroll, all these kids who have unstable identities, who are, oftentimes making bad decisions or experiencing abuse because all of the, moral, guardrails are off the rails. And so they're, going through wounds, and they don't have any moral grammar to identify why they're feeling this bad and this suffering. And then here come these TikTok psychologists that are saying, well, it might be your parents. It might, and if you're 20 years old, you don't probably have that many places to look other than the way you were brought up, right? That's kind of the most obvious place. So, I think that's a big part of it. Another part that I go into in the book is just, expressive individualism, that we have really sort of identified our value as being how we can kind of live out our true self in an authentic way into the world. And, one way actually that I'd like to think about this, because I think it's a tidy way of seeing the change, is that, maybe 2 generations ago, say a woman is married to a man and in love with another man. 2 generations ago, we would have said, well, you're living a lie. That lie is your fantasy with that man, and you need to live honestly and commit to your husband. Now, a woman who's married in love with another man, you can very easily imagine her reframing that as like, my marriage is a lie. To live my true self, I have to be with this person I'm in love with. Bridges of Madison County. Think of how many movies have been built around that theme. So, that sort of authenticity, I think is the kids are really deeply, have absorbed. And so, that creates a lot of moral chaos, it creates a lot of wounds, and it creates a lot of sourcing for a culprit. If you want to maintain a victim identity, you have to find a perpetual perpetrator. You have to be an accuser. There's no perpetual victim without a person who's a perpetual accuser. And the accuser is the nature of the devil, right? So it's no wonder we're a society that's roiled in conflict, accusation, division. I mean, I think that's where we're finding ourselves now.
What do you hope that this book and your research can lead to in terms of maybe solving some of this very sad trends that we're seeing? Yeah.
Well, the nice thing about ideology is that it can't really withstand much scrutiny. That's a beautiful thing about the truth. The truth can withstand any scrutiny. And that's why people who really are, they have the preeminent value of the truth are open to debate, open to, you want to invite objections. You want to course correct. Ideology is very, censorious. What's that?
Fragile.
Yeah. It's fragile. It's got a hollow core. That's right. Yeah. It's censorious because it cannot thrive under scrutiny. It has to be coercive. It has to be silencing. And so, oftentimes ideology is greatly defeated by just shining light on it. I mean, that's what I tried to do with Awake Not Woke. It's what I'm trying to do with this book. But also, I think, I was listening to an expert kind of in this movement the other day, and I really admire him, but he said something that I take issue with. He said, we used to raise children differently. We used to raise them to, sort of respect our values and, grow in the faith or conform to good things, live a solid moral life. And now it's all individualism. We're telling them, be who you are in defiance of anyone who tells you not to be who you are. That's the most important thing, to be yourself. And, which can be a fine message, but taken to an extreme, it can be really deranged. And he said, that ship has sailed. We don't parent like that anymore. So we need to deal with how we're parenting now. And I disagree with that. I really think that, one small thing I'm trying to do, or big thing I'm trying to do with my small book, is to say, as a culture, we can change. We really can change how we look at how we ought to raise children, how we ought to relate to one another, what we think it means to be human. We can change the narrative. And I think we're seeing that, all these young adults coming to the church. It's a great sign of hope to me. And one of the things I think is that, this generation, Gen Z, is really sorted. I see this group that is kind of diving deeply into this ideology. And then I see this other group. It's like, oh my gosh, we want God. And they're gonna, need to be deepened and directed. And so, one role I see for parents, particularly ones who are estranged, is to say, why don't you mentor people? You've got wisdom to share, things that you wish you'd done differently, things that you did well. Find other people, even if it's not your own children, but in your school community, maybe, grandchildren, maybe nieces and nephews, maybe in your church. People need mentors because a lot of our guidance has been exposed to be folly. And so that person-to-person witness is going to be really important moving forward in how we shape, the next generation.
I love that. It's very hopeful.
Yeah.
Because anybody can do that.
That's right.
Person-to-person witness.
That's right.
Pick up where you're at, wherever you are. Make a friend, love someone in your family. If you're married, do some project with your spouse in the parish. Just get in the fight by just one person at a time.
Absolutely.
Loving one person at a time. Hearts and minds, I believe, do change.
Yeah.
But it's often through, truth and not compromising the truth. And then the willingness to share that in a loving way.
Yeah. And it's beautiful.
And there it is.
And people are hungry for it. Let's give it to them.
Yes. How can people follow you, Noelle, and be ready to get this book when it's ready and just follow your writing and all of your work?
Yeah. Well, they can find me at theologyofhome.com, at eppc.org. I'm on Instagram under my name, Noelle Mering. I'm easy to find.
Amazing. Love it. Thank you so much, Noelle. This has been a lot of fun.
This is great. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Lila Rose Show with Noelle Mering. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out Noelle's stuff. It's over at the link in the description. You can go find all of her work. It's really fascinating. Make sure you're following her. I think she's such an important thinker and writer today. Also, don't forget, subscribe. If you're listening here on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed. Also, if you're on podcast app, make sure you're subscribed. Give us 5 stars. Leave us a review. Helps the show reach more people. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time. And a huge thank you to EWTN, Eternal Word Television Network, which is the largest religious broadcaster in the world. You can get access to Lila Rose Show episodes 24 hours in advance at EWTN.com/on-demand. And a big thank you to EWTN and their incredible mission to bring souls to Jesus.